Okay, hello. This lecture is on Neoliberalism and Nature, and it's part of the Understanding Contemporary Environmentalism course at the University of Manitoba in the Department of Environment and Geography. In this lecture, I'll introduce in more depth neoliberalism as an ideology, and I'm going to make some connections to how we conserve nature within the 21st century from this field of neoliberalism. So let's start with what neoliberalism is. I've posted a podcast that deals with this in the context of the United Kingdom, but given that the journalist in that podcast talks really fast, I'll start by covering some of their material and move on from there. Neoliberalism, as they argue, is the general governing ideology of our world today, even though it's rarely acknowledged as such outside of academic circles. Neoliberalism is a governing strategy that focuses on the economy, but as we will see, has aims at the social sphere as well. It arises primarily in practice in the 1970s and 80s, but it's actually has sort of intellectual roots that go much further than that. And it's often it's really a reaction to what is often known as embedded liberalism or Keynesianism. Embedded liberalism is a form of liberal capitalism that was implemented after World War II, in which the power of the state was used to regulate financial markets to fulfill the aims of the state. What this means is that governments put restrictions on the economic activity of their country to achieve their goals. So, if the government was concerned with providing healthcare, as we were in Canada shortly before World War II, they took over the provision of healthcare and regulated it so that the competition in that realm was restricted to only that kind of competition that the state wanted. Or, if they were interested in building up their wheat production and protecting it from international intervention, they would take control of that production, setting a price and ensuring that farmers were not subject to the fluctuation of the international market. This is, of course, what happens with the Canadian Wheat Board, also prior to World War II. By the end of World War II, you have this sort of generalized agreement through the Bretton Woods conference that this kind of economic practice by states was acceptable and, in fact, beneficial for all. Embedded liberalism says that financial markets are a tool that should be used by the state. It was believed that these markets could be manipulated to provide for regulated economic growth under a watchful eye of the government. Now, neoliberalism, as you might be able to guess, sees it much differently, and in essence, flips this thinking over the head. In neoliberalism, the market is the perfect vehicle to achieve the best outcome for a country or a society because it allows for competition to reign supreme, and only through competition will people to be able to find their fulfillment and freedom. Under neoliberalism, then, the role of government is not to manipulate the financial markets in the country, but to protect them from interventions. And so here we have neoliberalism as a series of policy initiatives, government strategies, and economic principles that seek to reduce the direct role of government within certain spheres of life, specifically the kind of market-based spheres. What this means is that neoliberalism advocates for limiting government regulations over almost any financial transaction, suggesting that the market itself will allow the will of the people to come through. So, in food production, it argues that something like a wheat board, because it limits the competition and artificially supports industries that can't compete, isn't a practical, healthy, or economic thing to do for a country. Why, asks neoliberalism, should we use our farm to grow wheat if we can get it cheaper from somewhere else? Instead, we should either innovate and figure out new ways to make our products cheaper, or we should adapt and move to another market where we can compete. Now, it's important to say that the vision of neoliberalism, in which the free market becomes the organizing element of society, is best understood as a guiding principle in today's world, as opposed to the overarching rule that can't be broken. That is to say, when decisions are made, there is generally more effort than not to follow this principle, but is often broken due to opposition or because it is in the interest of some industry or class to keep it protected. So, for example, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the banking and auto industry received significant support from the federal government in order to protect its markets. And many would say that, in fact, this explains the decisions being made throughout the soon-to-be former Trump administration that are sort of more protectionist, that rather those protectionist arguments or practices are being done in the support of a certain class of industrial capitalists. Now, to help explain this concept of neoliberalism further, I want to talk about three different but specific realms of neoliberalism as an ideology and explain how they relate to conservation. Now, the first realm of neoliberalism that I want to talk about is the one that we most often associate with neoliberalism, which is the shrinking of government involvement into the financial markets and the lives of citizens. There's a slogan associated with this about, sort of less government is better government. And it was the calling card of conservative politicians from Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to Stephen Harper. And you still hear it from Donald Trump and especially the sort of larger Republican Party in the United States. Neoliberalism blames government intervention for excessive spending that is wasteful, for regulations that hurt industry and keeps them from competing. These regulations often include taxes, labor laws, and sometimes even environmental laws. Now, one of the primary approaches within neoliberalism has been to take any of the embedded markets that existed and to privatize them and open them up to private ownership and competition. This was the case for many government services throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s and 2010s, where once publicly owned corporation would be sold off to private ownership. And this was the case in Manitoba, where telephones were privatized in 1997, or in Winnipeg, where the city garbage collection was privatized in 2005. And the premise here is that competition drives costs down and reacts to consumer demand, so it would provide for a more efficient and beneficial service. Now, this isn't always the case. We can look to a number of examples, especially, say, the power industry being deregulated in California in the late 1990s, where, in fact, costs go up, the inefficiencies increase, and privatization doesn't follow through. It's one of the arguments of neoliberalism that government should only provide those services that the market can't provide. So we might think of something like policing or indeed governing, although there have actually been a number of ways in which both of those fields have become increasingly moved over to market opportunities. For social services, there is again a push to decrease the state's responsibility, and they often suggest that if we let the market rule here, there will be opportunities for private organizations to take over and do the work that social services once used to. So we see a rise in charities over the past 4 decades of neoliberalism, partly in response to decreasing social services, but perhaps more accurately because spending money on charities provides you with a tax credit. Again, a governing strategy to increase the amount of social service spending that the private industry does. So these are practices that are said to decrease the influence of government into the lives of citizens. Now, in the environmental field, it has resulted in the reduction of environmental regulations, the opening up of different areas for extraction, but it has also meant that there is a large base for environmental organizations to draw upon for their funding. So the decrease in government, while perhaps causing some strife for environmental organizations, has also been part of the rise of what we've, sort of talked about as big green. Now, the second realm of neoliberalism that I want to talk about is much more closely intertwined with conservation. And this is very clear in Morgan Robertson's wetland banking reading. Now, this is the realm of producing and protecting markets. In neoliberalism, the market is what produces the good of society. So the state's role is to protect and provide opportunities for the market to work. And privatization is one of those experiences, or one of the aspects of producing markets, where the government opens up new financial markets for the private sphere to engage in. But there's other ways in which this realm of neoliberalism works. So protection of private property is one of those, as without private property, we don't have markets. Now, this is, of course, a traditional role for the state, but in recent years, we have seen the idea of private property expanded to ideas and creations. So in the digital age, states have increased their surveillance and protection of media private property as well as the patenting of ideas. Now, this protects the markets for movies and musics and other creative commodities, as well as the markets for scientific advancements. Now, the work that Robertson outlines in his chapter is also part of this realm. In it, he talks about how much effort goes into the production of a wetland mitigation banking system. This is the work that the state does in order to achieve the aims that they want. And there's a lot of sort of backroom negotiation and creative problem solving that goes into the producing of these markets, but also a large role for the state in producing these markets. The work of producing a wetland mitigation bank is an act that produces a new market, something that wasn't there before. And while it is private organizations that benefit from these markets, it requires government guidance to get it going and into being in the first place, and to maintain it along the way. Thus, when we talk about neoliberalism, it isn't actually just about cutting government, but rather it is about channeling the actions and initiatives of the government in different ways. This is called the re-regulation of government. So in the case of wetland banks, there is a new role in approving and monitoring those banks, or at supervising the practices of such approvals. Now, a final area within this realm of neoliberalism is the protection of these markets. This comes in a number of forms, including the use of police to contain protest against the privatization and production of new markets. In the case of something like pipelines, you see a large use of state force to protect these industries from protests, something you saw over the Trans Mountain pipeline, as well as the Keystone XL pipeline and the battle over Standing Rock. Another example related to pipelines can be found in the Trans Mountain pipeline, which faced significant local and provincial opposition. Now, the federal government stepped in 2018 and bought the pipeline to shield the private capital that was invested in it from the losses due to this opposition. Once the pipeline is built, it will likely be sold again to private ownership. This protects the market from opposition, even though that opposition, in the market's terms, would have actually made that market unprofitable. But the state established that it was more important to keep this market alive than to let it suffer the sort of consequences of protest. What we see within this re-regulation realm is that the government does, in fact, have a large role to play within neoliberalism. It's not just a matter of governing less, as they might often say, but rather it's a process of governing differently, of creating markets as opposed to creating objects or taking care of markets instead of the direct responsibility of taking care of citizens. Now, the third realm that I'm going to cover today focuses on neoliberalism not just as an economic strategy, but as a cultural pattern. In her early tenure as leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, Margaret Thatcher once remarked that economics is the method, the object is to change the soul. That is, she says that the economic strategies of neoliberalism ought not to just be about changing the financial ways of the nation, but are also about changing the character of the nation. Now, in his lectures on neoliberalism, Michel Foucault noted that in this way, neoliberalism holds within it a set of processes that enshrine competition into our everyday life, such that our decisions in life are often taken as if they were all financial decisions. Now, of course, this is the case for decisions that do have perhaps financial implications about where we're going to live or what kind of food we're going to eat or things like that. But he also says that neoliberal thought pushes us to consider our lives in a kind of cost-benefit way, even outside of the economic realm. So, what sort of value will I get out of my university degree? What will I get out of this romantic relationship that I'm in? These kind of questions, he suggests, happen because we have been taught to think as if we are always in competition and therefore always in danger of being left behind. The result is that we treat our lives as if it is a business that needs to constantly improve and gain more. He called this being an entrepreneur of the self, or our entrepreneurial self. I often think about this in the context of extreme sports, where I see so often that these are often meant to be sort of testing grounds for businesses or employees, or more material forms of success. Thus you get, sort of posters like this one here about thinking about risk and the benefits and costs of risk. Now, this is what Jessica Dempsey talks about with her focus on enterprising. Under neoliberalism, nature is asked to pay for itself, to make itself count within the logic of the market. Otherwise, it wouldn't be counted. She calls this, to make live, you have to make it economic. It is a quote-unquote permanent economic tribunal which justifies an action based on its ability to balance a cost-benefit analysis. Now, this comes to the heart of neoliberal rhetoric, which is that it focuses on the individual as the building block of society. Individual freedom, whether it's freedom to fail or freedom to succeed, is the prized ideal of neoliberalism, and many of the policies are sold based on their ability to supposedly provide more individual freedom. And so here, enterprise is a valued part of our character and of our sort of everyday approach to the world around us. And in that sense, we come to see the world not just as a field of competition, but we come to see the world as an ability, a place to kind of affirm these neoliberal values, even if we're not fully committed to them in our minds. We're often pressured or pushed or even taught to think that way. So from these realms, what do we see as the consequences of neoliberalism? Well, the first thing, and one that both Robertson and Dempsey ask us to see, is that we know that neoliberalism isn't just a set of governing practices. Rather, it is a way of seeing the world from our everyday behaviors to our interactions with nature. That is, it's a holistic or a larger worldview as opposed to just an economic theory. The second, as Dempsey points out, is that the practice of making nature economic is not easy, and it is built upon a whole infrastructure of expert knowledge and processes. This means that the value of nature under this kind of system depends not just upon its ability to be commodified, but also on the experts who facilitate that commodification. In doing so, it takes the value of nature out of the hands of those who interact with it, perhaps on a daily way, and puts it into the hands of experts who aren't often even in contact with that part of nature. Third, in this process, nature, and even the citizens that use it, are turned into passive objects that are managed by these systems. This is a form of governmentality, as he might have recognized, where the expert systems of governance depend upon people who follow patterns and processes. Within neoliberal nature, or parts of the non-human world, are also meant to follow the patterns and processes of its economic life. And so we sort of are conscribing nature to fit within this realm of sort of cost-benefit analysis, but also of an entrepreneurial nature. Not only are we as ourselves forced to enterprise, but so is nature. Fourth, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, none of these practices of neoliberalism are ever established in perfection. As both Dempsey and Robertson point out, these processes are always articulated within other frameworks. Neoliberalism rarely exists as a pure ideology. Instead, it is mobilized in conjunction with other ways of seeing the world. Indeed, because it is focused on translating social values into economic values, it works exceptionally well in tandem with other values, like conservation and environmentalism, as both Dempsey and Morgenson sort of illustrate in their description of the ways in which the aims of conservation and environmentalism are easily folded into this logic of economic enterprise and the sort of cost-benefit analysis of our use of nature and the ability to sort of make nature economic. So with that, I'll end it there. We'll continue with this discussion in class, focusing on some of the some of the actual sort of more specifics of the reading itself, as pointed out in the reading guide.